morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us. Thank you for joining the webinar today. I think we're still seeing a few people join the webinar now, but since we're at 2 minutes past the hour, I think we can just get started. So again, hello and welcome to the webinar by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This webinar is about the science-based target setting steel sector public consultation. My name is Paulina Tarrant, and I'm the Net Zero Engagement Manager at the SBTi, and I will be your host for this webinar. We are very excited to have this webinar today as it launches the public consultation of the steel guidance that we are developing. The steel project kicked off last October, and it will come to a close in April or May in 2023. So we're taking this opportunity now to get feedback on the draft guidance. And it's the first time that we're releasing it publicly beyond just a small group. So we're very interested to hear what you think and are excited to share with you here today. So before we get to get it started, I'm just going to go through our slide with some housekeeping and a few guidelines for this webinar. So this is a Zoom webinar and your camera and microphone are automatically muted. Participants can send questions via the Q&A function in Zoom below. And the slides from this webinar will be shared after this call. And please note that this webinar will be recorded for the benefit of those who cannot attend. So those will be shared with you afterwards. This is the agenda for our webinar today. We have scheduled an hour in total, but we expect to get through the content in a good deal less time than that. So we'll leave plenty of time for live Q&A. So we'll start off our agenda with an introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We'll move into providing an explanation of what science-based targets are, including some important information about our collaboration with the Mission Possible Partnership. We'll talk more about our net zero standard and the differences between near and long-term targets. And then we will have SBTi staff, along with our technical partner for the project, the Energy Transitions Commission, that will present our project on steel. So they'll go over what the guidance we have been developing covers, what topics we are seeking feedback on during the public consultation that's launching today, and then we'll finish off with a Q&A session. So to get a better sense of our audience today, we just want to do a quick poll so we know what kind of organization you represent. So we're just going to launch that, and if you could please mark your answers on that poll. And I will review the results in just a few minutes. Thank you. While the poll is running, I'm pleased to introduce to you the team that is working on today's webinar. So we have Carl Downey. He is the Senior Technical Manager and Industry Lead at the SBTi, and he manages the work on building steel and cement. Brenda Chan is also joining us. She is the Technical Manager at the SBTi and leads the work on steel. And then we have Rafał Malinovski, and he is the project manager at ETC, the Energy Transitions Commission, and he is our technical partner for this steel project. I will moderate the Q&A sessions, and my colleagues who have done the same before, as we did in the earlier session this morning. And I also want to thank those that are working behind the scenes on the project in this webinar. We have Amir Khan and Paulina Moreno, and it's thanks to their work that this webinar is happening. So with that, I think we'll close the poll. And as soon as we have those results in, I can read. So it looks like the vast majority of our attendees today are here from companies. We also have about a quarter of our attendees from consulting firms. And then we still have quite a substantial amount of NGOs, industry associations, and also some academia and some other participating as well. So with that, I'm now going to hand over to Carl Downey, who is our industry lead from the SBTi's sector development team, and he will give an introduction to the SBTi and delve further into the background of the project. Thank you. Carl, on to you.
Thank you, Paulina, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. So yes, in this section, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the SBTi, to what science-based targets are, and to this project on steel. So the SBTi, for those of you who don't know us, we are a collaboration between 4 organizations: CDP, the UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF. And what we do is we encourage companies to take ambitious climate action by setting climate targets that are aligned with the latest climate science. And we do this by developing resources so that companies can understand the level of ambition, so the level of emission reductions needed for their particular individual case. And we also offer independent validation of company targets. We can see on the next slide very good progress that we've made since we were launched in 2015. We now have over 1,900 companies already setting science-based targets and well over 4,000 committed to set targets. So that means we've already reached a key milestone, which is a critical mass of over 20% of high impact companies setting targets for many sectors and for many regions. So in other words, science-based targets are now becoming mainstream. On the next slide, we have a few figures that show what impact this is having in terms of climate action. We're seeing that companies that are setting science-based targets decarbonize faster than the market as a whole. So I'm not going to go through all of these numbers on the slides, but just a few. So we've seen that on average between 2015 and 2020, companies that had approved targets reduced their emissions by 29% in comparison to an increase in emissions in the economy as a whole over the same time period. And by the end of last year, we've seen that companies that have approved targets or commitments to set targets were representing already more than 1/3 of global market capitalization. So we can see the initiative has quite impressive reach. Just a little bit about who we are. Now I want to say a little bit about what science-based targets actually are. So our net zero standard, which was released last year, lays out the full framework for long-term and near-term targets. So long-term net zero targets are made up of the 4 elements that you can see on the slide. The first one is, of course, a 1.5 degree aligned near-term target. So that's a target with a time frame of 5 to 10 years. The second element then is the long-term target. So that's a target to reduce emissions to a residual level by 2050 or sooner, which means an over 90% reduction compared to today's emissions. The third element then on the slide is optional, but it's recommended. So since science-based targets need to be based on real emission reductions within the value chain of the company, they cannot rely on offsets or compensation. However, that doesn't mean that those actions beyond the value chain cannot have value. They can be valuable to encourage emission reductions in other parts of the economy. So therefore, companies may wish to embark on these kinds of voluntary additional actions, which we call beyond value chain mitigation. And then the final part, the fourth part on the slide here, is obligatory, and it's saying that when a company reaches its very low emission level by its long-term target date, it must further commit to reducing those residual emissions to reach net zero through permanent removals from the atmosphere. So that's our framework in broad terms. Now, on this slide, I want to talk a little bit about when we're looking at near-term targets, how do we determine for an individual company what their emission reduction should be? How much is enough to be able to say that you're 1.5 degree aligned? So in SBTi, we have 2 main target setting methods for doing this. The first one is shown on the left-hand side of the slide, and it's used for the large homogeneous sectors, and that's the case here with steel that we're talking about today. And here, companies are expected to converge towards a sector decarbonization path, which is expressed in terms of carbon intensity. So that is CO2 per unit of something, per ton of steel in this case. So this convergence means that not all companies' targets are the same because they actually depend on the company's starting point. And we sometimes refer to this method as the sectoral decarbonization approach, which is why you're going to hear us talking about the SDA later in the webinar when we talk about the steel-specific methods that we've been developing. So in a few moments, Rafal from ETC will be talking about the carbon intensity pathways that were selected for steel in order to apply this SDA method. Then the other method, which is used by SBTi, is on the right-hand side of the screen, and it's used for the other sectors, and it's called the cross-sector absolute reduction method, or the carbon emissions contraction. We expect all companies to reduce their emissions at the same linear annual rate, and it's used when no sector method exists. And it's still relevant for today's discussion because steel companies, while they will be using the SDA for their steelmaking emissions, they may have other activities that they would have to be covering by the cross-sector method. And then on the next slide, I want to say one more thing by way of an introduction to who we are and who's working on this. And this is an important announcement that was made in September, which is that the SBTi and the Mission Possible Partnership have joined up in a technical collaboration. So the MPP, if you don't know them, they're an alliance of climate leaders focused on efforts to decarbonize the highest emitting industries. And one of the ways they do this is by developing very detailed technology roadmaps for these sectors and with these industries. So this collaboration between SBTi and MPP means we intend to work together on many of these heavy emitting sectors to align as far as we can and to make use of the detailed modeling work that MPP has been working on. So just to be clear, this doesn't mean that SBTi would automatically endorse all of MPP's sector pathways. This will be more on a case-by-case basis. And today's discussion on steel is a case in point, because in fact, this is the first sector for which we're having a very detailed technical collaboration here, because our technical partner, who is ETC, are part of MPP, and we've been using the detailed modeling that they did with MPP as the basis to develop the pathways that we needed to set an SBTi target setting method for the steel sector. So now I'm going to move on to just a general introduction to our steel project. But before I do that, we do have a second poll to the audience. So we're going to launch that now. This poll asks the question, where is your organization based? So we can launch that poll. And in the meantime, I am going to continue with my introduction of the steel sector project. So, but I should say first that, of course, companies in the steel sector could already set targets using the SBTi's tools, and some have already done so. But we launched this project in order to be able to provide much more detailed guidance to this sector, and also to upgrade the ambition to 1.5 degrees. So we're well over halfway through this project. We're well on track. Today marks the launch of the public consultation on the draft guidance and tools, and that will run for 2 months. And we intend to publish the final resources in Q2 of 2023. So the full timetable can be seen on our website. And then the final thing that I want to say about the organizational aspects of this project is that one of the important parts of all of SBTi's resource development projects is the creation of an expert advisory group that accompanies the project. So the steel group can be seen on the slide. The members here were carefully selected to provide a diverse balance of companies, NGOs, and academia, as well as diversity in terms of geography across the globe. So it's important to know that the role of this group is advisory. The final sign-off on deliverables is by the SBTi. And that means that the documents that we're presenting today don't necessarily always represent the views of the whole expert advisory group, but of course we do intend to reach consensus where we can. And the other last thing I should say is, of course, what we're presenting today is a draft. These are proposals. We want your views on them. They're not the final deliverable. So now I'm going to hand back to Paulina for the next part of the agenda.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you to everyone who has submitted to the poll. I think we will close that now, and I can just review the results with you quickly. So again, thank you for filling out the poll. It looks like the large majority of our attendees are from North America and Europe, but it's great to see that we have 13% of the attendees from South America, and as well as some participants from Asia and Africa. Again, we had another session this morning for other time zones, so we will have seen a different spread of answers in that time zone earlier on. So our next speaker is Rafał Malinowski from our technical partner, ETC. Unfortunately, Rafał will not make it to join us live today, and so we will play a recording of his presentation that was prepared in advance. Rafał will go into some technical detail on how we selected the 1.5C pathways and the system boundary to be used for target setting. We are aware that some of the slides in the recording are not easy to read, so rest assured that you will receive these after the webinar, and we will also show some of them again later on in the presentation. So yes, don't be worried about that. And with that, I'll hand it off to start the play of the recording. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Rafał Malinowski. I am project manager from the Energy Transitions Commission side. And I had the pleasure to lead the effort with SBTi to set up a target setting methodology for the steel industry. And thank you very much for opportunity to speak in this launch event. So when we started the effort, one of the first things that we did was basically taking a look what is out there, because there is a breadth of knowledge and analysis when it comes to decarbonization strategies for the steel industry. So we took a look at them. And if you take a closer look, it seems that the numbers are a bit all over the place. But as it turned out, when we dug deeper into the analysis, it turned out that the differences in numbers, especially the 2020 numbers, are caused mainly by the differences in emission system boundaries. So basically, some of the analysis accounted for, in example, Scope 2 emissions. Some of them didn't. Some of them accounted for emissions related to off gases burned on site. Some of them didn't. So this is why we have this quite a widespread of the numbers, and we can also see that they exhibit quite a large difference when it comes to ambition level, especially by 2030. And this is driven by beliefs or assumptions on what is going to be the availability of novel technologies like hydrogen DRI or carbon capture and storage by 2030. And with that, we also have also an assumption on whether the infrastructure to support these technologies is going to be in place. To go through this exercise, because emission trajectories are crucial inputs into the SBTi SDA methodology, which we use to set targets for the companies. After discussions with the industry, we have analyzed the assumptions of each of the pathways, and in the end, IEA NZE scenario was chosen as a scenario that provides the best blend of plausibility and emission level. The issue with IEA NZE scenario, though, is that its emission boundary differs quite widely from the ones that, in example, can be seen in World Steel Association CO2 data collection handbook, or example, responsible steel system boundaries. So what we had to do to use this scenario was to align the system boundary with what we propose, and this is the result, right? So we had to adjust both the budget and the annual emissions. So just so it is not misconstrued, adjusting the budget here doesn't mean that we just allocated more budget to the steel industry. It means that some part of the emissions, and most important, the emissions would be off gases from the steel industry used in the power sector, were accounted for in the power sector by IEA, So what we did is just bringing them back into the steel industry because, well, we could make an argument that this is responsibility of the steel industry, similar to how World Steel Association does it with the scope 1.1 emissions. So I started speaking about the system boundary, and this is one of the crucial features of many of the efforts that we see now in the markets of responsible steel, IEA analysis for the G7. So let's take a look what we propose here. So it turns out that with steel industry, the classical split of emissions into scope 1, 2, and 3 doesn't really meet the bar of quality and consistency. And it is mainly driven by the fact that steel companies can buy pre-processed iron from other companies, which well, not artificially, but it moves their emissions from scope 1 to scope 3, even without real reduction in emissions. So to account for that, what we propose is setting a fixed system boundary under which all the companies reporting under iron and steel SDA would be using. This is precisely to ensure that irrespective of the ownership structure of these processes, all the emissions related to these processes will be accounted for appropriately. So we had to put, of course, like boundary is defined by its bounds. So we had to put a boundary upstream and we had to put a boundary downstream. And when it comes to most important pieces that we dropped from the boundary on the upstream side, these are the methane emissions, or generally all emissions related to extraction of fossil fuels. The reason we did that is that methane emissions are not as well understood as CO2 emissions. So if we would allow companies to use, for example, default emission factors, they tend to come with much larger data uncertainty than CO2 emission factors. So for now, at least, we propose that these upstream emissions are not included. But in lieu of that, we propose that there is a mandatory scope 3 target for this piece of emissions. And the point of this mandatory scope 3 target is that, well, it is not as harsh as scope 1 or 2 targets in the SBTi realm. So it allows for this data, it leaves a room basically for this data uncertainty we have spoken about. But in addition, it also levels the playing ground between CCS technologies, which keep this burden of upstream emissions, and carbon avoidance technologies like green hydrogen DRI, which comes without that burden, right? So we need to ensure that these upstream emissions are somehow accounted for and somehow well, punished or disadvantaged. When it comes to downstream boundary, we put it at the hot rolling stage because it is the last emission intense step that is shared by vast majority of steel products. And also large part of the carbon footprint of the steel industry is driven by the off-gas emissions. So blast furnace gas, basic oxygen furnace gas, coke oven gas. And many companies use these off-gases to fuel their hot rolling process. So in order to ensure that we capture all of these off-gases, well, we were forced to put the boundary at the hot rolling level and even extend it a bit beyond downstream, right? So if any of these off-gases are exported to any other companies, we also propose that they should be accounted for. So basically we ensure that nothing is missing when it comes to off-gases from the boundary. But even with the system boundary, there is still an issue of large difference between ore-based and scrap-based production. So this is why we had to include additional modifications to the previous SDA methodology. what we did previously in the previous version of the SDA methodology, there was one pathway for each company for the whole steel industry. But the issue here is that we could say the steel industry is actually comprised of two quite separate or maybe quite different industries. So ore-based production and scrap-based production. And they come with totally different carbon footprints, and which single pathway does not reflect. So we tried splitting the pathway into two, and we made sure that just a difference with two other efforts that are currently out there, that they converge to the same point, because the assumption generally is that since scrap-based production is that much less emission intense than ore-based production, its ending point would be much lower as well than the one for the ore-based production. But in order to ensure that the scrap-based or heavily scrap-based producers don't have to decarbonize as fast as ore-based producers, because truth being told, they don't have to, we set the point or the convergence point to be the same for ore-based and scrap-based production. So we did essentially, we heard from many of the EAs that by treating steel in this way, or steel making in this way, we probably disadvantage companies that use a lot of scrap, or at least that we do not incentivize it. So we did a sensitivity analysis to check that. And this is maybe a bit complex table, but let me take you through it. So for all for ore-based and scrap-based production across the whole period, we made an assumption on how much scrap is going to be available starting from 2020 until 2015. And we analyzed, okay, so what is the implied carbon budget for each type of production, amount of production, right? So first is the budget in rows 1 and 2. Then we have amount of production, so the mass of production, or ore-based and scrap-based in the next 2 rows. And then we analyze, okay, so how much budget is available per ton of produced steel across the whole period. And it turned out, if we increase scrap availability in the system, the amount of budget available, especially per ton of ore-based production, increases greatly. This is driven by the fact that if we are able to produce more scrap-based steel with much lower emission intensity, we essentially free up more budget for the ore-based production. So this is what you can see here. So in this methodology, scrap serves as a global decarbonization lever. And what we mean by that is that benefit of the scrap is spread across the whole steel production, rather than being assigned to a single one company. This may be a bit controversial, but our reasoning here is that the amount of scrap in a given time, is finite. So if one company uses more scrap, that means that the other company can use less. So we do not achieve sector-wide decarbonization just because one company uses more scrap. But if there is a global increase in scrap availability, then indeed we achieve decarbonization. And this sensitivity analysis showed that this is exactly how we treat scrap availability. So when we say that it is a global decarbonization lever and it is not assigned to a single company, well, then there has to be some adjustment done on a single company level. So here we can see 3, maybe 4 curves. So first, so the highest one and the lowest one show the our reference points, right? So our reference emission intensity for 100% ore-based production, and the bottom one shows our reference emission intensity for 100% scrap-based production. And the targets are derived based on the use of scrap of a single company. So in this regard, it is similar to the sliding scale approach that is currently being used in other efforts like First Movers Coalition, like aforementioned IEA G7 analysis. But when a company at a certain point increases its scrap ratio, so here we have a very stark example, right? So for until 2029, the company is 100% ore-based producer, and suddenly in 2030 it has a change of heart and moves to 30% scrap feed. And what happens is that the target adjusts. And the target adjusts to reflect the fact that, well, no one adds scrap to the process to increase its emissions, right? So like the adding scrap to the process, adding more scrap immediately reduces emissions. But since we already accounted for this benefit of scrap use in the global pathway that all companies benefit from, we can't give the same benefit again for a single company. What you see here is that for 100% ore-based production, the 2030 emission intensity target would be roughly 29%. But because it changed in this last year to 30% scrap input, we are at 45% emission intensity target. So the adjustment that happened because of it is 16%. So this is basically to ensure that all steelmaking assets will need to decarbonize irrespective of how much scrap they use. Because what we fear would happen, if we didn't do this adjustment, what we fear would happen is that we would see a flow of scrap from companies without decarbonization, without SBTi, without SBTs, without decarbonization targets, to companies with decarbonization targets, without actually achieving decarbonization, sector-wide true decarbonization. So this methodology ensures that iron-making assets will need to somehow decarbonize by 2030. Questions, we would be very, very happy to answer them. I would like to, again, thanks for the opportunity, and I wish you all a great discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
All right. With that, before we head into the next session, we have another poll. So if we could launch that, please. We just have a question around your status of your company with respect to the SBTi. So whether your organization already has a validated science-based target, whether your organization has committed to set a science-based target, or if you're considering committing to setting a science-based target, or whether you're not interested in doing so. And then finally, if you're from an organization that is not a company, then the last option is for you. While we let the results come in, I just want to remind you that you can put your questions into the Q&A function of Zoom, and we have some SBTi staff in the background answering those live, and we will be able to answer a select few of those in the live Q&A at the end of the session. So with that, I think we can close the poll. Thank you. So it looks like almost half of you are considering committing to Science-Based Targets Initiative. So that is really great news. And if you have any questions on how to commit, then please feel free, and we encourage you to reach out to us to answer any of your questions. And you can find more information on our commitment letter on the SBTi website. then a large portion of you don't have the SBTi commitment letter or validation process applicable to you. And we also see that there are 7 companies already that have validated science-based targets and 2 others that have committed to doing so. So thank you for those answers. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues Carl and Brenda from the STEEL project to continue the explanation of the draft STEEL guidance. Thank you.
Thanks again, Paulina. So hi again, everybody. So now that Rafal has explained to you how the pathways on the core boundary were developed, in this section, my colleague Brenda and I are going to explain the other main criteria that steel companies will have to use when setting their targets. And we also want to highlight some of the main questions in our public consultation survey. So these are some of the big choices that we had to make in the development here, and on which we would like greater stakeholder input, so from all of you. So the first few of these questions are related to things that Rafal just presented. I understand that there was a lot of material to digest, so I would suggest that you download the draft guidance after this and the slides in order to fully understand them. But nevertheless, so that you know what questions are coming, there's 3 here. The first one is, do the guidance and pathways sufficiently incentivize near-term emission reductions in the steel industry? In other words, are they steep enough? Do you agree with the core boundary that we have outlined? And then do you agree with this use of a scrap input dependent approach? So the sliding scale that Rafal talked about, where the pathway for the sector is split into ore-based and scrap-based approaches, and a company's target actually depends on what its scrap input is and how that is going to change over time. So we would like your views on those. Now, on the next slide, I'm just going to show a few example targets using this methodology so it becomes a little bit more concrete for all of you. So as we explained, the target changes depending on the starting emissions for the company and the scrap input and how this changes over time. So on this slide, we can see examples of different companies with different starting emissions and also different changes in their scrap input. And we can see how they have to meet different reduction targets in terms of carbon intensity shown in the column on the right. So for example, if we look at companies B and company F, they have the same starting point, but company F is intending to increase scrap input dramatically and so has a steeper target. And then to help stakeholders understand this, why would these 2 companies have different targets? We are proposing that this should be made transparent in the published target, which is what I'm going to show on the next slide. So in all of our guidances to sectors, we usually give rules on how companies can express their targets to make sure that these are really clear. And as I explained in the last slide, for this sector, we're introducing or proposing a new requirement compared to other sectors. So because the calculation of the target depends so much on the company's scrap input and how that changes over time, we found it important to include this in the target wording, be transparent and robust from stakeholders' perspective. So an example target could then be the one you see on the slide. Company E, which is the same company from the last slide, commits to reducing their emissions within the core boundary by 32% per ton of hot rolled steel by 2030 from a 2020 base year. And then they need to add a sentence on the scrap share. So the scrap share associated with this target increases 1.5 times over the target timeframe. And then in the guidance, we also provide examples on how targets covering the emissions that are not falling within the core boundary must be set. And we also provide example wordings for these that you can see on the screen. We do then ask about this in the consultation because we want to know whether you believe it's appropriate to publish this information in the target and be transparent about this. So we have a question about that for your input. Then on the next slide, we also have one final question, which is about scrap. And this is about the definition of scrap. So we've discussed in the expert group different ways that the scrap input could be defined. So there's reasons for and against defining it as only the externally purchased scrap. or also including home scrap, so scrap generated internally from the company's own processes. So considering there's actually different views on which of these two is better, we would like your views on these two approaches. The next thing I want to talk about is really just to build upon or reiterate some things that Rafael presented about the boundary. So this core boundary, as explained, it has certain implications when companies are not carrying out all of the activities within the boundary themselves. So the most obvious example of this for this sector would be a company purchasing some intermediate products such as iron in various forms or coke, rather than producing them themselves. Well, in these cases, the emissions associated with producing those intermediate products by upstream companies, which would normally be more considered a scope 3 emission, here must be included within the boundary of the core target set by the steelmaker to make for a more comparable basis for reductions. And then, as also hinted at by Rafael, we have some emission sources outside of the core boundary that are nevertheless very important. They are responsible for very significant emissions. So SBTi's generic rules would say that a company needs to cover those kinds of activities in its value chain with scope 3 targets. This only becomes mandatory when scope 3 emissions are significant, that is more than 40% of total scope 1 and 2. But for this particular sector, we found that there's one source of emissions that's so important that we've decided to make it mandatory to be covered by scope 3 targets, and that's the methane emissions from extraction of fossil fuels. So here we are requiring a scope 3 target covering upstream emissions from all fuels and energy in all cases. And we know that, of course, there are challenges around obtaining the data for these emissions. So that's why we're keeping it as a separate scope 3 target rather than including it within the boundary, because if we included it within the boundary, it might weaken the robustness of the core targets, and also it would have weakened the case for the carbon budget that we are assigning to this sector. So now I'm going to hand over to Brenda, who's going to continue explaining further some important elements in the guidance.
Thank you, Carl. Can we move on to the next slide? Yes. The guidance also cover high alloy or stainless steel producers. These producers will have a very different emission profiles than the carbon steel producer because of two reasons: upstream production of ferroalloys and also the process emission during the steel making from the carbon content in the ferroalloys. However, specific 1.5-degree pathway do not exist for these processes, so we propose here a simple fallback. High alloy steel producers can use the steel pathways for their steel making and must use the SBTi generic methods to cover the ferroalloy production. And this is shown on this slide. Upstream ferroalloy production, it is outside the core boundary, and it should be covered as a separate scope 3 target, irrespective of the share of the total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And then we ask in this question in the next slide is, given this simplified approach, we asked about this in the public consultation, said due to the absence of ferroalloy 1.5-degree emissions pathway, high alloy steel producer may use the steel pathways for their steel production and must use the generic methods for ferroalloy production, either scope 1 or scope 3. And do you agree with this approach? So we hope to have your feedback from this. Companies may also set scope 3 emissions target outside the iron and steel SDA boundary highlighted here, such as transportation of scrap, using any of the cross-sector target setting method provided by the SBTi, and also follow the greenhouse gas protocol, which is the required cradle-to-gate emissions. This slide summarizes guidance for the upstreams and downstream companies, either supplying raw materials for steelmaking or use the steel products. They would normally need to cover their steelmaking emission as part of their scope 3. So this guidance will describe it here. For upstream suppliers, we distinguish between those intermediate products, which is almost always used for steelmaking, such as iron ore, and those that may not be, such as hydrogen production. Iron ore suppliers can set their Scope 3 target using the iron and steel SDA or other Scope 3 method. For hydrogen producer, on the other hand, as hydrogen is considered as a sector agnostic product, so they cannot use the iron and steel SDA unless they can prove the product the companies sold are solely used for the iron and steel making. Otherwise, they should use other Scope 3 methods. Likewise, emission from the manufacturing of steel may be a relevant Scope 3 emission for companies such as automotive and construction value chain. The steel SDA, rather than the generic Scope 3 method, may be used for Scope 3 target setting, where the emissions concerned are from the manufacturing of steel. However, as reduction of the use of steel can be a key lever to reduce their Scope 3 emission for this type of company, so this company may want to consider setting absolute targets. The requirement and the recommendation in the next two slides are about harmonizing with other SBTi guidance. The first is the requirement. Since calculate the target depends on the future company absolute emissions. So in order to ensure that the carbon budget is not exceeded. So companies submitting target must provide justification for their growth forecast used in their target calculation. And the second item is recommendation, because steel sector does rely on breakthrough technology for a lot of decarbonization, especially post 2030. There would be a risk that company could meet their target, their near-term target without investing in any of these technology, just by improving in energy efficiency or fuel switching, for example, without being on a path towards net zero after. So we do ask company to demonstrate that they are investing in this breakthrough technology that would lead them towards net zero, even if they aren't relevant for their near-term targets. And the final recommendation in the guidance is about the idea about the optimization of material use. In this case, it's optimization of how much steel that you would use in construction project, for example. It is a decarbonization lever because it allows us to have absolute emission saving, even if we are not changing the carbon intensity of the steel. So to capture this, when we have the target based on carbon intensity, we would also need to publish an absolute emission saving we're going to make. So this is not a mandatory, but company that want to demonstrate the progress on that lever to optimize their use of their products may want to think about publishing also the absolute emissions target. Yeah, this brings to the end of our presentation. Thank you very much. I pass the time back to Paulina.
Thank you, Brenda. So before we jump into the last session of the webinar, we're going to open up one final poll for the audience. So as that poll gets launched, okay, here it is. So the question is, what is the area you are most interested in with regards to the steel science-based target setting guidance? So you can choose understanding how science-based target setting works for the steel industry, learn what the target setting process entails, and learn how science-based targets will encourage industry to decarbonize. While we let you answer that question, I will introduce the final section of the webinar. So we will now have our speakers rejoin us for the Q&A session. Thank you to those of you that have submitted your questions. We encourage you to continue to do so in the chat. We will try to get through as many of those as possible, and we'll answer some of those live now. So I see Carl and Brenda here, and I think we can close the the polls now. And just to really briefly review the results of the poll, it looks like most of you are interested in understanding how SBT target setting works for the steel industry, and then followed by learning what the target setting process entails, and then also how will the SBTi encourage, or how will a science-based target encourage industry to decarbonize. So thank you again for those. And Carl and Brenda, welcome back. I will start off with a question that I have here for Carl. And so Carl, why do you see a sliding scale, i.e. having different pathways for primary steelmaking and secondary scrap-based steelmaking? Does this not just allow primary steelmakers to continue to have much higher emissions and maintain the status quo?
Thanks, Paulina, for the question. Yeah, indeed, this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions that we're going to get about this. In fact, I would say the opposite is the case. So the first thing to clarify is that here we're not talking about comparing products or producers on the basis of their carbon intensity. We are talking about science-based targets, which is about a percentage emission reduction between your base year and your target year. And that's different for different types of companies, and our methodologies show you how to calculate that in order to be able to say it's 1.5 degree aligned. In the old system that we had, where we just had one pathway for this sector, companies could just meet their targets by increasing the amount of scrap they were using. And it meant that primary steel producers were not incentivized to make changes to decarbonize the actual primary reduction of iron part of steelmaking, which is the really challenging part. So the sliding scale means that they can't meet their targets just by using more scrap. Instead, they're forced to work on that part of the production and reduce those. And it also incentivizes steep reductions for the secondary producers as well, which of course don't start from zero emissions either. And then to the question that we sometimes get asked is whether by somewhat neutralizing the effect of scrap in decarbonizing, are we somehow disincentivizing a generalized move towards more circularity and more scrap, which we know is necessary in 1.5 degree scenarios? And the answer is no. Anytime that you have a push for greater decarbonization, you're being pushed to use more scrap-based production and more electrification, because for two reasons. One, the way we've calibrated the system, that the pathway for the secondary-based production is a bit more lenient, so it's advantageous to move towards that pathway. And the other reason is that you have more levers to decarbonize if you're moving towards more electrification. So if you're pressurized to decarbonize, it's in your interest to move towards the electrified or secondary-based routes.
Thanks, Carl. The next question will be for you, Brenda, and that is, what data should companies use for their Scope 3 emissions, and how is scrap accounted for in those Scope 3 emissions?
Okay, companies should follow the Greenhouse Gas Protocol rule on data quality. They are encouraged to use primary data from their suppliers. So if not, secondary default data will be accepted, but it should be a cradle-to-gate basis. In terms of scrap, it's better to look at the life cycle approach. Post-consumer scrap, leave the product system, become zero emission product. The emission they need to account for it is any subsequent processing or transport of that material to bring into your production. So by this reasoning, our proposal is for purchased scrap will have no upstream emission, but they need to account for because they are accountable within the core SDA boundary. But potentially some transport or processing emission, they would be covered in a separate Scope 3 target if they want to set this target. Yeah.
Thanks, Brenda. The next question is on CCS and CCU. Are they included? Carl, perhaps you could take that question.
Yeah, so carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and use. Here we haven't written anything specifically for steel. So how I'm going to answer this is more generically across SBTi, and that is that carbon capture and storage is considered a way to make emission reductions towards meeting a target if you're talking about permanent geological storage. For carbon capture and use, here the question is still a little bit open because we are lacking cross-sector guidance on this. Some issues are not yet settled. So, for example, how permanent is the sequestration of that CO2 going to be? How would you allocate emissions between, or emission savings between different actors, the one capturing the CO2 and the one using it, things like that. So depending on the type of carbon capture and use, we could be talking about an emission reduction, or we could be talking about what I mentioned earlier, which is beyond value chain mitigation. And in fact, we don't see this as a barrier to setting targets now. The guidance tells you how much you should be reducing. The individual levers on how you're going to get there can still be a little bit open for the moment.
Great, thank you. And so I think we have time for just one more question since we're coming up on the hour. And Carl, one more for you. How is regionality being taken into account in developing the methodology, especially for emerging economies where both growth and support for decarbonization may differ?
Yeah, great question. So for some sectors, we do offer pathways that are not only global, but might be regional, but not for the heavy industries like steel. And this is for a good reason. We are using a convergence approach that I mentioned before, that companies are expected to converge around the same CO2 intensity. So we actually don't need a differentiated approach based on different regions, because the companies' starting emissions are taken into account with that approach. So if they're in a region that may have a different portfolio of technologies, that's taken into account in their calculation when they're calculating their targets.
Great, thank you. And with that, I think we need to start wrapping up the webinar. So if we could just pull the slides back up with our wrap-up slides. And thank you, Carl and Brenda, for answering those questions. So finally, we invite you to provide feedback on the SBTi steel guidance that is open for comment until January 23rd of the next year. The guidance and materials can be found on the SBTi Steel webpage. The link is here in the notes. And again, slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on the SBTi Steel webpage. And so with that, on the next slide, we encourage you to please get in touch with us if you have any further questions. So you can find our contact information here. And finally, thank you again for everyone who joined us today. We're really excited to hear your feedback on the Steel Guidance Public Consultation. And thank you for our speakers for presenting at the webinar today. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.